Welcome to Risk Hedge Radio. I'm your host, Jonathan Roth. Today, I'm joined by a return guest and someone that has been inadvertently in the international news a lot over the last couple of weeks. Neil Howe is the managing director of demography at Hedgeye Risk Management. But the reason he's with me today is that he's one of the co-authors of a best-selling book entitled The Fourth Turning, What the Cycles of History Tell Us About America's Next Rendezvous with Destiny. Written back in 1997, today, the book is being closely examined because Steve Bannon, President Donald Trump's chief strategist, is a huge proponent of the ideas The Fourth Turning espouses, and he even made a movie about them called Generation Zero. And that has some people worried. Neil Howe, thank you for joining me.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
Neil, in The Fourth Turning, you say that societies have these cycles of roughly 80 years in length. And over the course of these 80 years, there are four turnings or social eras that evolve through stages of what you call, first there's the high, then there's the awakening, the unraveling, and then there's the crisis. Can you give me the specifics of what is involved with that last stage, crisis? Because that's the one that Steve Bannon seems to have zeroed in on.
Well, I think since we're now in it, I think we should all focus on it. You should always pay attention to the season you're in, particularly when it's one in which public history, tends to move rapidly. And we are in that season right now. The crisis season of the saeculum, the sort of, lifetime length period you're talking about, is a period in which institutions are torn down and rebuilt from the ground up, usually under the threat of some realist a sense of historical urgency. There is a sense that the republic, the empire, whatever we are politically, cannot be sustained, cannot survive unless we make very rapid, very wholesale policy changes, political changes in a hurry. And we've seen these instances repeatedly in American history. Bruce Ackerman calls these the three constitutional founding moments in U.S. history, the American Revolution, the Civil War, and the New Deal, World War II. But there are others, if you go back even before the American Revolution, and we think there's a similar periodicity in other modern societies around the world. I think the deep premise of our book, even going beyond what the fourth turning is just the very concept of seasonality in history. I think one thing that we modern Westerners tend to be attracted to are theories of history which presuppose that history is linear. It's just constant progress. Or for some of us, it's maybe constant decline. But in any case, it goes one direction or the other. Or maybe for some, it's just so complex, it is chaotic. There is no pattern at all. And in fact, most academic historians take pride in the fact that they look for no patterns in history. Anyone who looks for historical patterns, particularly broad historical patterns, is generally denigrated in the profession of academic historians. It's something that's just unfit, for the scholarly palate. We shouldn't even be talking about that.
Your comment about that's something I wanted to actually zero in on, because this whole, I think the last couple of weeks of news has really been started by a historian from MIT named David Kaiser, who wrote an article in Time magazine titled Donald Trump, Stephen Bannon, and the Coming Crisis in American National Life. And he actually described you and your co-author, William Strauss of The Fourth Turning, as amateur historians. And yet you have a master's degree in history from Yale, and you work in the subject matter daily. I mean, how did you take that?
Well, he didn't, I know David Kaiser. He's actually a friend of mine. I don't think he meant that in a pejorative way. By amateur, he simply meant that I do not work professionally in academia. I don't have a tenured academic position. That's not what I do for a living. therefore I'm an amateur. I did not take that in a bad way at all.
Okay. That's good to establish.
And I will say David Kaiser is actually an example of a professional historian who actually speaks very highly of what we say. In fact, he gave us a wonderful review when our first book came out, when our Fourth Turning first came out in the Boston Globe. So he's actually been very much a supporter. But there are others who, think the whole idea of looking for any kind of patterns or rhythms or cyclicality in history is simply pseudoscience and astrology. You should just never even, it just, without even looking at it, without even looking at the evidence, they just think, that's just something no respectable person should engage in. Now, what I was getting at though is that I said that's when I say about we kind of modern Westerners, I do think that traditional societies, pre-modern societies, almost always look at history and social time as a cyclical phenomenon. And you will see this traditional societies everywhere. Mircea Eliade, the famous philosopher and historian of religion, basically says that in traditional societies, no one ever does something for the first time. They simply reenact things that ancestors have done, right? Everything is looked in terms of reenactment or repetition, which is very, very powerful idea in traditional societies. And I think it continues in modern society. We just decide not to look at it. We decide not to look at the seasonality of our own experience. And I think the evidence is just unmistakable. And I think that this isn't like astrology. There are very real social forces that bring about the cyclicality, namely generational aging. Generations that are shaped in their childhood and coming of age moments, in their habits and their behaviors and attitudes in certain ways. Later on, age in a predictable time period later, roughly 40 years later or so, into the senior leaders and parents who in turn shape history. So shaped by history, the same groups later shape history.
Very, very fascinating, and there's so much there that we could unpack and discuss. But what I'd like to do then is move directly to what's happening in the news today. To what degree do you personally know Steve Bannon? I think, or at least have you met him? We should at least establish that.
Yeah, I know him. I'm not close to him, but I've certainly worked with him on and off for a number of years, basically on film projects and creative projects. He is, look, there have been very in-depth feature stories done in major media papers about him. Some, I would say, in both the Globe and the New York Times have actually been quite fair. I think a very unbiased treatment of him. I think I didn't find anything sort of out of the ordinary about him politically. Like most other Americans, I didn't know what alt-right was until I read about it in the media, right?
Right.
So that was kind of my position. I think the main thing people should understand about him, which I think maybe has not been portrayed in the media, is that he's not so much a policy person or a person with fervent policy or political beliefs. He's fundamentally a culture person. He has aesthetic sensibilities. He's really interested in sort of how socially and culturally Trump's coalition hangs together. And I do think that Steve Bannon, along with a few other people on sort of more the conservative side of the spectrum, took an interesting lesson from the Fourth Turning, and that is that our prediction that this era would see the successful merging of economic populism and cultural and social conservatism. And I think that new amalgam and the political realignment that would trigger is something that they did see in that. And I think that it's something that they ran with it. I will add that it's something that the Democrats could have picked up that football and run with it themselves, right? It was there on the field. Anyone could have picked that up and run with it. But I think in this case, conservatives did. And maybe I should just add, on this subject that, the fourth turning has been used heavily by both sides of the political spectrum. I mean, it might be useful to remind people that the first huge fan of our work back when Generations first came out was Senator Al Gore, who mailed a copy to every member of Congress and was a huge vocal supporter of our work. And in that book, when we described the millennial we sort of coined that whole expression and began people thinking about this new millennial generation. In our later work, when we really spent a lot of time looking at millennials and who they would be, a lot of people on the left kind of championed that description because they saw in how we described the millennials this sort of optimistic, community-minded, team-playing generation of young people that would work for progressive ideals and move America in a progressive direction. And I would say that a lot of the energy around the whole concept of millennials in politics has definitely been on the Democratic side and not on the Republican side. And that's actually, I think, something that we were part of.
Fascinating. Well, I know that Steve Bannon has been quoted extensively discussing these basically four great crises that America has had in history: the Revolution, the Civil War, the Great Depression, World War II. And he believes that the 2008 financial crisis was really the next one, the big fourth turning that's happened here in American history. And he believes that it's still being worked out to today. And I think events obviously prove that. You're the one that came up with this. What's your take on whether or not he's right or wrong about the financial crisis of 2008? Could that really be categorized as a fourth turning, do you think?
Well, it's, an event is not a turning. An event happens in a year or so or whatever. It's an event. A turning is a generation-long era. There's the great crash of 29 and, Black Tuesday and Black Thursday and all that, right? And then there's the Great Depression and World War II. So one's an era, the other's an event. I would say that in our terminology, 2008 was, and we said this at the time when 2008 came along, that 2008 has become the catalyst. That is to say, the introductory event, the event that kicks off the current fourth turning. The current fourth turning is going to have a lot of other events we haven't seen yet, right? And in my opinion, it's going to have things that are potentially going to bring us a lot more volatility, going to be much more catastrophic, if you will, in its implications for markets, the economy, and our political system than what we've seen. And I think obviously with the election of Trump, people are beginning to see us drifting further into that vortex, right? And I think that's totally aside from Steve Bannon. I think that's why people are interested in the fourth turning, because people sense almost an inexorable quality about it. And, fantastic things that may happen to our political system we've never seen before. I was just noticing on Ladbrokes this morning, the London betting site, did an incredible, that you can get 47% odds right now that Donald Trump will not survive his 4-year presidency. He will either resign or be impeached by the end of it. Well, that's pretty amazing, right?
It sure is.
And it's particularly amazing, and this is what I kind of struggle with and I'm just actually fascinated by, is that we see right now record low realized vol and implied vol in the markets, and continuing records being broken, all right, by equity markets. So how do you put all that together? And what the hell is going on, right?
I mean, I think you framed it right there, really, the phrase, what the hell is going on? I think that's what a lot of people are asking themselves right now. Now, I think this is the general fear that seems to be out there, at least in the mainstream media when they've been addressing this question. And I think it's predicated upon this idea that if Steve Bannon believes the idea that, that we're in another fourth turning right now, that we're in the midst of it, then does that color his decisions as they apply to what President Donald Trump should do vis-a-vis U.S. foreign policy, vis-a-vis refugees to the United States, vis-a-vis policy towards immigrants coming into the U.S. from Mexico, these sorts of issues, and even this idea of some sort of global war against Islam, these sorts of ideas. How do you take those disparate ideas and then put them into what you believe as is the direction moving forward for America? Do you think Bannon's on the right track? What's your perception of where he's at?
I don't think it really matters. Once you understand truly and you see clearly what the options are, it's sort of obvious that you're in the winter of history, right? And I mean, let me give you a hypothetical example. What if Franklin Delano Roosevelt, say, after his second New Deal, after he ran for the presidency for the second time, maybe in 1937, became convinced that America was in a fourth turning? Would that have changed how he behaved? We do know that Roosevelt. We know this actually, interestingly, you actually raised the name of David Kaiser, who actually is a diplomatic historian. He's actually written a couple books about FDR and the sort of foreign policy decisions of the 30s. We do know that FDR understood long before most other Americans that it was absolutely inevitable that America would get wrapped up in what was happening in Asia and Europe, right? The rise of fascism and the near inevitability of war. He was convinced that we were going to get wrapped up, but he couldn't get too far ahead of the American public. So he would float up periodic trial balloons. But it's clear to me when I read his correspondence and his writing and so on, he knew where everything was going, right? He just knew he couldn't get that much in front of the public on it. So it's kind of an interesting question. One thing we do know is that in fourth turnings, leaders draw energy from that urgency and sense of crisis when people perceive it. And I think that's just one of the realities. It's when Pearl Harbor happened that America mobilized. And as we all know, that America definitively exited, the Great Depression. And that's simply an attribute of the fourth turning frame of mind and the rediscovery of community and the creative destruction of public institutions. And you remake the world over again. One thing I will say, people are often overly fixated on the negative aspects of fourth turning. They think, it's a crisis. That means terrible things happen. But it also means that public institutions are reborn again. They're rejuvenated. And the whole playing field of wealth and power tips to the young again. I mean, that's something we haven't seen recently in America. And it creates, it sort of restarts public time over again. We can create a new order. We can redo our infrastructure a new way, right? We're not sitting there picking our way through all the rights and privileges that have been given to older people. Right now, we couldn't even start a huge infrastructure program even if we wanted it, right? I mean, I'm sure you've seen the literature coming out on all the review processes and regulations. It's practically impossible, even if we have the money to actually build anything public in America, right? Mm-hmm. So these periods of urgency actually allow us to sort of clear the deck, so to speak, and do something new, and solve large problems that in an earlier era had seemed insoluble. I mean, one of the things that early in the Great Recession that seemed insoluble is these whole problems of inadequate aggregate demand and this huge pessimism about secular stagnation. And yes, that was the 30s. It was when that phrase was invented. As well as problems of international chaos and competitive devaluation, things we talk about today. The fact that every nation could do whatever the hell it wanted. And they thought there was no answer for that. The future looks so bleak. But by the end of World War II, we created, Bretton Woods and the UN and the World Bank and the IMF. We created this whole global structure, a concert of nations and basic rules of the game, with which the entire world prospered peacefully for decades after that. And this is one of the good things about fourth turnings. And so I mean to say that every season in history is necessary. It may not be what we want, but it serves a function in a way. In the parlance of today, it takes us maybe to talk about sort of, the self-empowerment movements. We would say it's something that takes us out of our comfort zone, right? And pushes us forward. So that's not an endorsement of any particular policy, or saying, oh, well, that's for that reason we should be reckless. No, once you're aware of what's at stake, that's every more reason you need to be very careful about foreign policy. But the fact that we're here and we face all these issues, we have to deal with them one way or another. And that if things get worse, a leader is going to have to draw new energy, amidst, the sense of peril, is simply something that we've always experienced, in a fourth turning. And I've told people with regard to Trump, I think that Trump faces sort of a bimodal outcome, a bimodal distribution of outcomes, which I think is one of the reasons why his behavior seems so erratic. I think on the one hand, if the markets stay high and everyone stays energized and Democratic opposition to what he does isn't so bad, maybe he can push through enough stuff so that, maybe he can sustain the prosperity or sustain markets, although I think that's a tall order. But I think that on the other hand, if things really break down and there's a bear market, a really bad bear market, I think given the valuations, it could be severe early in his administration, early in his first term. He would draw energy out of that. I think Trump would glory in a bear market. I think he would love it. I mean, he would go around telling everyone this is the feeling of, corruption leaving our body, and I wasn't part of the system that brought us here, right? He was inveighing against, Janet Yellen's bubble economy, constantly through his campaign right up to his election. So he's positioned himself for that. And I think actually with the Dow sinking and with the S&P sinking, he'd be in a much better position to push his policies through a Republican-led Congress, which would know that it's the most unpopular member of that troika, Trump, the Democrats, and Republicans. And they would have no choice but to buckle under and listen to him and do his bidding, particularly at a time, by that time, the public would be demanding action of one sort or another. So I think either way he wins. I think the one way that Trump would fail, or it would be the least desirable for him, would be something in the middle, right? Something where kind of meddles through, but there's general resistance, and the Democrats are pretty much effective at miring them, and with lawsuits and process and filibusters and what else, and keeping them from moving forward. And then what that's likely to do is actually lead probably to the idea of a recession closer to the end of his term, which of course which without having really accomplished anything, I think that would be kind of the worst outcome for him. And indeed, I think in that case, there may even be a possibility, as the London betting markets were saying, that he could leave before his term went over. I mean, let's face it. I mean, he could. He certainly doesn't need it for any reason. I mean, one wonders. I think people have often wondered why Trump actually wants to be president. It's not immediately obvious, but one could imagine a lot of scenarios under which he might just feel better just saying, "Well, I've had enough of this. I think I'll leave." But I think that would be worse for him. I think the better scenario would be like Ronald Reagan in his first term, have your really bad bear market early on, right? Push your stuff through Congress under the shadow of that bear market, and then get your rebound late in your first term.
Interesting. Do something Rahm Emanuel, I think, was the one to never let a crisis go to waste.
And Obama really did let that crisis go to waste, because other than the short-term expedients of huge deficit spending and TARP and all the rest of the stuff, he really didn't use those first 2 years to do anything really enduring. I wonder if he actually regrets that. I don't know. Given his personality, he probably doesn't regret it. But yes, Rahm Emanuel is correct. They did waste that.
You study society, and I think you're probably the perfect person to ask this question to. For the first time, maybe in my lifetime for sure, I've actually read in more than one place this idea that the U.S. is primed for some sort of civil disturbance or even civil war because the cultural divide in the nation is so wide and so deep. You study these trends, you study generations. Is the U.S. actually that fractured that this sort of antipathy, political fracturing that's been going on between the Republicans and Democrats, could that actually lead to something like that? Or do you think that this is a repairable situation at this point?
Look, I mean, on the surface of it, I would say no. I think like a lot of people, I say, no, it's not that bad, is it? I mean, come on, we all get up in the morning and we all go to work and we're all basically decent guys. So it seems hard to take seriously, although it's very instructive, to look back on some of the excellent, books and histories that have been written of the 1859, 1860, and the 2 years, leading into the Civil War. And it's fascinating because, right up to the end, no one really realistically thought that actual war would happen. I mean, it just seemed incredible, right? I mean, what? We would actually go to war? And it was interesting. Even after the southern states seceded, they all thought, well, okay, this is kind of a peaceful thing. And the Union was one of the big issues actually that arose that actually caused the crisis was the fact that everyone thought, well, we could all secede in peace and so forth. And Winfield Scott and many of the elder generation sort of said, well, let them go in peace. Let's not disturb anything. But the catching point were all of the federal institutions in the South, all of the post offices, and particularly all the federal forts, around the coast, and obviously including Fort Sumter, where you had this, West Point trained, officer who basically said, everyone else just took down their flag and said, okay, we'll give it to the South. Well, and everyone was happy, then not a shot was fired. But you had this one West Point trained officer who basically said, no, I'm not surrendering this thing. I took an oath. So, and it made me wonder because I often think, we joke a little bit about Calexit, right? About California, and California now becoming a sanctuary state, not just cities, but this very aggressive campaign now in California just basically said, well, maybe we should consider, even not paying certain federal taxes and so on. And you wonder, and it's the kind of thing where you can imagine that everyone would think, well, this is kind of a joke, or this is maybe very serious. I think everyone would take it very seriously, actually, but I think the idea of actual conflict would not happen. But then I wonder about Coronado, Naval and U.S. Marine Corps base out there in San Diego, where, someone's just going to say, well, no, I took an oath. I'm not handing this over, right? And what happens is you just have a spark like that, and then it takes you into some space that you never expected. Do you know what I mean? And I think that's what you have to worry about. Now, I don't think we're there. In fact, I would say that I think we moved away from that possibility a bit with Trump's victory. I think that the idea of actual violent insurrection of some sort, or people being in a more kind of militant mood regarding the federal government, would have actually been higher had Hillary been elected, just simply because of the temperament of the red zone versus the blue zone. One can imagine, right, Idaho and Texas and, all the usual suspects being particularly incensed, right, at this point. So I think we actually, and the reason why I think it's very clear we took a step back from that is that the particularly industries, the gun industry and the survival industry, whereas in the 48 hours after the Trump victory, when all of the other stock prices went up, stock prices in those industries actually went down. So I take it that expectations were betrayed there, right, in a negative way for those industries. But I do think that in a fourth turning, all of the stressors increase. So it's not just these red zone versus blue zone, which you're referring to, and now it's the blue zone, which is starting what they call the resistance and so on. But I think that you have to imagine that you're going to see financial market stressors, economic stressors, foreign policy stressors, actually interacting on that divide. And I think that may take a little bit of time. That may take, a few years to worsen perhaps. So it's a mix. And I think that when you see all that mixed together, particularly at a time of greater adversity, then those divisions you talk about could be, could really blow up.
So in your opinion then, going full circle here, is Steve Bannon the right person to be sitting next to President Trump, given that he really does seem to understand these cycles of history and how they interact?
I guess what I'm saying is I don't think it really matters for the people making decisions. They have to make decisions in a practical, worldly way based on the threats that they face. And I guess what I'm suggesting is once you're in the fourth turning, you begin to realize you have no other direction to move anyway. Do you know what I mean? So it doesn't really matter whether or not you have this strategic vision. Once you're there, you kind of have to go, a certain direction kind of makes sense. But I do think for those of us who are looking forward and trying to think about our kids, our finances, where life will be going for our families forward, I think for all of us looking forward and just figuring out what the world's going to be like, I think then it is very useful to think about seasons of history and what kinds of events are more likely over the next decade and what kinds of events are very likely in the decade after that. So I think for those actually engaged in day-to-day policy making and responding to threats and so on, it may be good to have a general idea of where you are, but I think the events kind of pretty much, compel you to respond certain ways. And that's why we have had fourth turnings in American history and other societies around the world, regardless of whether people have been aware of it or not.
So fascinating. Neil Howe's book, The Fourth Turning, is a fantastic read. I recommend you pick it up so you can better understand our world. Thank you, Neil. Really, really appreciate your time.
Great. It was a pleasure.
Visit us online at riskhedge.com. For Risk Hedge Radio, I'm Jonathan Roth.